Welcome to the Atlantic Council studios at the IMF. I'm Beth Baltzan. I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council GeoEconomics Center. Very happy to be joined today by Sam Elghanayan and Kevin Keller. Sam's with the Office of Rokana, but speaking in her personal capacity. Kevin is with the Harvard Kennedy School. You're a fellow there. We're going to talk about state-owned enterprises, privatization, and development. So let's get into it. This is a conversation I've really been looking forward to having, partly because we're going to connect some dots that I don't think always get connected, but also because for 2026, the Atlantic Council is going to be the think tank, the T20 to the G20, which will be hosted by the United States. So this is a perfect conversation to lead into what we will be talking about next year. Kevin, maybe I will start with you. So you've done work on the World Bank, privatization, but then what they did in the People's Republic of China, which was not the usual Washington consensus privatization agenda. Tell us what you found when you've looked at that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a historian of international development, and when I was doing my coursework and learning about the history of international development, there was a very clear narrative we were taught, which is that the World Bank, when they were working in countries in the 80s and the 90s, they carried out structural adjustment programs, and one of the main elements of those programs was privatization of state-owned enterprises. For my research, though, I researched Chinese economic development, and when I was going through the sources there and learning about the World Bank did there, what I saw was totally different. That in China, the goal wasn't to push the Chinese government to privatize state-owned enterprises. Rather, it was to accept that ownership and control of enterprises would remain with the state, with the Communist Party, and instead try to make them more efficient. And so working with the premise of state ownership, the World Bank invested a lot of time, a lot of manpower, produced stacks of reports, trying to help the Chinese government think through how can we take these state-owned enterprises and help them produce more goods and better quality goods with the same costs.
And is that approach in China, it sounds to me like it's different than the approach they took in these other countries. Can you tell us a little bit about why they took that approach based on your research?
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. And I think there are a few reasons that what the World Bank did in China was different than what they did elsewhere. The one that we have to get on the table that I think is the most important is the World Bank just had less power in China. That there were debt problems in China during this period, but China was never in debt distress to the foreign world. And therefore, because it didn't need the World Bank, because it didn't need the IMF, these organizations had less leverage to sort of encourage Chinese leaders to do what they want. Another reason, though, beyond that, is that China provided an amazing source of credibility to the World Bank. Then the 70s, of course, there was global economic turmoil. Countries all over the world were in really deep debt distress. And the World Bank during this time was coming under really intense fire. The critics from all over the world were saying, you know, your solutions, they're pretty minor, they're pretty mealy-mouthed. Where we actually do have bigger projects, they're sort of making things affirmatively worse. The World Bank was really under fire, internally and externally. And when they were able to work with China, all of a sudden, they could really defend a lot of those claims. They could say, we're not just a proxy for the United States, we're working with the most populous socialist country in the world. And they could say, we're not clueless, we know what's going on, we're helping the greatest economic miracle of the last century. And so by working with China, the World Bank was able both to fend off external critiques, and I think this is really important, and this comes through in surveys of World Bank workers, it was able to provide an internal psychological source of confidence that was really in short supply during those decades.
So the World Bank ended up course correcting in light of criticism into something that was less strict Washington consensus neoliberalism. So that's the perfect way to start with you, Sam, to talk about premature deindustrialization, which is something, I'm going to be very honest for myself, I had not focused on until I went into the administration, the Biden administration, and we heard from counterparts in developing countries that they were experiencing premature deindustrialization. For us, we had been quite focused on what's going on in the United States and that China shock issue. So thinking about premature deindustrialization, you studied under Danny Roderick, who is the person who identified this problem and surfaced it. What should we know about premature deindustrialization?
Yeah, so I'll try to explain the theory of premature industrialization that my former professor, Danny Roderick, came up with, and then I'll try to describe some of the causes and the impacts and maybe the implications. So in terms of like how it works, the typical trajectory for early industrialized countries, like the US and the UK, was, maybe it'd start mostly agrarian, there was a little manufacturing employment or production, and then you'd have maybe a century or so of rapid industrialization, followed by a painful deindustrialization where there was loss of jobs in manufacturing, often as a result of globalization, but continued strength in the value of manufactured goods because of some labor-saving technology. So using the US as an example, manufacturing employed less than 3% of the labor force in the early 1800s. And then in the 1900s, it reached a peak of about 25 to 27%. But then after the, that was in the middle third of the 1990s, and after that, deindustrialization started to set in, and now we have, for the last 2 decades or so, the share of employment in manufacturing is just under 10%. So only a few developing countries, especially in Asia, have been able to kind of follow this trajectory, where there are obviously harms from deindustrialization, and we know those all too well and can talk about them, but they've still benefited a lot from the mature manufacturing industry that they were able to develop. In contrast, developing countries, many developing countries follow this pattern that's a little bit different of premature deindustrialization. And what that's looked like is they built up modest manufacturing industries around the 50s and 60s behind protectionist barriers and policies like import substitution, especially in South America. But then deindustrialization, so the loss of jobs and of manufacturing jobs and the value of what's produced in manufacturing set in, and just took hold much sooner, just a few decades later. So one of the things that makes that challenging is that it happened at much lower income levels and before those economies were able to absorb a lot of labor in manufacturing industries. So I can take maybe Brazil and India as an example. So they're emerging countries that have done relatively well in terms of growth. In Brazil, the manufacturing share of employment stayed about the same in around the 1950s to 80s, from about 12 to 15%. But then since the late 80s, Brazil's gone through a period of deindustrialization. And India similarly had manufacturing employment that peaked at just 13% in 2002 and has just been declining ever since. Shockingly there, they've also seen a return, an increase of agrarian employment, which yes, absorbs a lot of the population, but doesn't create many value-added goods. The problem here is that developing countries are deindustrializing before they're able to build these mature manufacturing industries that can employ large shares of especially low and middle skilled workers, before they can develop globally competitive industries with comparative advantages that allow them to compete with others, and before their incomes could rise to the level of incomes that we saw in the US. They're happening at just a fraction of what we saw with early industrializers.
And it's not like what we saw in the United States, where the argument was, and it was an argument that I don't think held, that we were just going to move from manufacturing to services,
Right.
and they were going to be really high-paying jobs, not the jobs that don't have benefits and barely minimum wage and non-competes for fast food workers. But they haven't even achieved that. So however bad it is in the United States, we at least reached a level of development. They are further behind, never having had that opportunity in the first place.
Exactly.
So I think to tie these two conversations together, for either one of you who would want to weigh in, Kevin, I'm really interested with the issue of efficiency altogether, because one of the critiques we had when we were in office was, what do we mean by efficiency? Is efficiency downward pressure on wages? Is it not enforcing your environmental rules? Is it currency interventions? What exactly do we mean by efficiency? So from my perspective, at least the way the conversation's gone with overcapacity is, there is, when I read your work, and thinking about the premature deindustrialization piece, a real concern that it is in fact that SOE juggernaut in China that has had, we know all about the China shock in the United States. There's now a conversation about whether it's heading for Europe. It seems to me it's not a leap to think that that also is at least correlated, if not causative, of some of what we're seeing in these emerging economies. Does either of you want to weigh in on that?
I'll just say a few things. I think you've really put your finger on the pulse of like the big question over the next 10 years. That I think that, you know, in the 90s or 2000s in the United States and especially in the rest of the world, sort of what were governments for? What did we want? It was economic growth. It was getting rich. And then all of a sudden we've seen China has achieved this beyond anyone's wildest dreams. We've seen that they were able to go, these organizations that were extremely efficient, by which I mean producing a lot at low cost, they were able to expand all over the world. But now with some hindsight, we're seeing there's also negative sides of this. There's the labor issues we're talking about, there's the environmental issues. And so now I think around the world, we have to take a step back and say, okay, maybe efficiency is what we wanted at some point, but there has to be a more expansive view of what the good life and what a good state is. And that doesn't mean we have to push back against everything China did, but it really means looking back at the records all over the world and sorting out what's good, what's bad, what we want to take, what we want to leave behind.
And sometimes it gets misinterpreted, I think, as wanting to keep China down. And
Right.
that certainly wasn't our perspective when we were in office. It's not about keeping China down. It's about making sure that China succeeds, but that it succeeds in a broader context of what we call fair competition. Harry Truman called it, fair dealing. So, Sam, you've lived in Africa. Can you tell us what you saw on the ground?
Yeah, so I worked in economic development and then a social enterprise for financial inclusion in Sierra Leone and then in Uganda. And there was a strong presence that you would see on the ground of Chinese companies building infrastructure. And one of the big things that we saw was a lot of roads. And it's purely anecdotal, but there was some tension among Sierra Leoneans and Ugandans who've been there for generations around who had access to the jobs that were coming from that infrastructure work and what the infrastructure work was serving and who it was serving. A lot of the roads led, for example, to mines, which a lot of locals were not benefiting from the extraction of mining wealth in the country, at least not to the extent that they could. And so there's certainly tension there. And of course, I mean, we've seen in Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka lost its port to China after it wasn't able to pay its debt. That doesn't seem to be serving the country.
Yeah. One of the things that I suspect is going to come up when we review USMCA over the next year or so is the question of investment. So I used to work on the Hill. I was at USTR in the 2000s. I did all those supply chain rules. Those rules were designed with an emphasis on where the production is located, not on who's doing the investing. And there are concerns about, we saw it with connected vehicles when we were in office, that there's concern about where all the data is going in those cars. We don't think about that. It's a car, but it's really a computer. But also the investment model that is allowed under the rules, but bringing in your own people, not necessarily supporting unions. The whole point of the renegotiation of USMCA for House Democrats was to find a way to have labor rules that would be win-win for American and Mexican workers, which is a really important point that I don't think a lot of people realize. They think it's, they'll call it protectionist or neo-colonial or what have you. So I'm interested in what happens in the USMCA debate. Kevin, do you have thoughts on, do you have recommendations or anything that you would want to offer?
I think my recommendation on this point really builds on sort of what Sam was just talking about. So a lot of my research looks at how leaders in Africa and the rest of the global south sort of make sense of the Chinese growth experience. And I think we have a lot to learn from that, and that they're very sophisticated at looking and saying, this is what we like from China, this is what we don't like from China. This is the aspect of the Chinese model that really seems to work and could be imported here, and this is what isn't. And I think that now it's time for people in the US to really look at China in the 1980s and 1990s. I think they were very sophisticated in their interactions with foreign capital, that they allowed foreign capital in, they allowed foreign enterprises to build factories, but at the same time, they were very careful to say, you need to hire this many Chinese workers, you need to have this level of sharing of intellectual property with us. And I think oftentimes when we think about this history in the United States, it's from the position of sort of like anger and frustration, but I think there's a different way to look at it and say, this is an example of China did something in a very effective and sophisticated way. Now we have to look at that, look at history, see what it can teach us, and try to carry on something similar in the United States moving forward.
And just to add to that, and to pull on what you were saying actually in your answer to the earlier question is, speaking about the USMCA and the focus on labor and protecting especially good jobs, good union jobs. That's one of our core values in the US. That's one of the things that makes America an incredible country. And I think you need to enshrine that into law, and hopefully it can be something that spreads to other countries through trade deals like the USMCA. One of the other things I was hoping to pull together these two threads of premature industrialization and excess capacity and even concentration of production in single countries. So let's first define excess capacity. So it's the production in a country of goods to an extent that surpasses not just the domestic demand in that country, but global demand. And there are three indicators of excess capacity. So whether that production capacity is expanding greater than there's projected global demand, rising production investment despite profit losses and inefficiencies in firms, and low or sharply declining capacity utilization rates in the country. And China is showing all of those signs. So there's good reason to suspect that China is experiencing excess capacity. And these aren't new. China's admitted to in the past to having excess capacity in sectors like steel, but today we're seeing the risk in new sectors, especially sectors that are critical to another value of ours, which is the transition to sustainable products, EVs, batteries, solar panels, and the products that go into them. And there's a similarity today to what we were talking about with premature industrialization, and that if China creates more supply than there is demand, it puts pressure on prices it puts artificial pressure on prices, and then it's hard for other countries in the U.S. and especially in developing countries that haven't built up this comparative advantage in their manufacturing to build those important components in these spaces, which then can lead to concentration, and we're seeing concentration in some of these key supply chains. I would add to those automobiles, and this becomes especially concerning when you have China saying that it might pull back on its trade of things like critical minerals that are so important to so many different supply chains, and we saw the actual, that's a fear of what the impact could be, but we saw the problem with PPE supplies during the COVID pandemic. That's, people's lives were on the line. And I think the impact of China's excess capacity today is going to be even wider spread and bigger than it was before, because China's manufacturing production represents 31% of global manufacturing production. That's twice as much as the next biggest producer, the U.S.
Yes. I'm really glad you brought that up. I was in South Africa over the summer, and it really illustrates the conundrum for developing economies that don't have infinite funds. Nobody has infinite funds to spend. And so you've got this choice to make, which is, do I buy all of this extremely inexpensive energy and the grid and all of that, if I do that, the chances of my having my own industry disappear. And there was a real tension between people who were saying, just get it as fast as you can. We saw it in the Biden administration with the debate over solar, and there were some people who really took the position that it didn't matter if any of that was made with forced labor, which is that's a very unusual position to take, but that price is king. And so you've got a non-market economy intersecting with a market economy or a series of market economies, one of whom is not being constrained by price and profitability, while almost everyone else is. And that seems like it's going to be a very tough problem to solve for.
Yeah. No.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to talk about some of the ways that the Biden administration dealt with that may or may not be accessible to lower income countries. So the Biden administration took some really important steps to managing that, including having our own large investments in important manufacturing sectors in the U.S. through things like the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the infrastructure bill, diplomatic engagement with our Chinese counterparts, including through the Economic Working Group, and then narrow, targeted trade enforcement. I want to really emphasize narrow and targeted in the climate that we're in today. And then maybe I'll make a little plug for my boss's Modern Steel Act, which, if implemented, would make great investments in the steel industry in the U.S. To make modern steel that has increasing demand for lower embodied carbon steel and iron, while protecting workers from an unfair playing field and while supporting more union jobs.
I'm going to take that as an opening to plug what we did at the very end of the Biden administration, which was a series of policy papers on supply chain resilience. And I think they're still up on the website, but I have them if anybody's interested in looking at them. To your point, I actually wanted to come back to what you said earlier about PPE and the fact that people died. I'm really worried that we've memory holed the pandemic and the fact that it exposed choke points in the system. We're seeing the choke points in terms of critical minerals right now, but there are other choke points in the system. Your data on the role of the PRC, I've been told that the PRC is using AI not to figure out how to eliminate jobs, but to figure out how to be even more efficient in manufacturing, in which case that looks like it's just going to get much worse. So those papers were designed to help us think through building blocks to get ourselves to the next place. We don't have anything off the shelf. There is no alternative off the table for the Bretton Woods system, but we can find our way to that. So that was our effort to try to move in that direction. And it's interesting to see the Europeans move on steel.
Yes.
We had negotiated with them, trying to do something I think that was ambitious on the clean energy side, and they are under a lot of pressure from their industry to address the challenges. And so all of these things that were deemed protectionist, we're all starting to figure out. But you also have you've also got trade. It's not just SOEs. You've got trade in your work. So you're nodding along.
Yes.
Jump in.
Well, what I think was really interesting is that I think that China's economic growth has become so naturalized that there are sort of astonishing things that I think are really hard to understand. So, for example, Chinese state-owned enterprises are spread all over the world. They're many of the biggest corporations in the world are these state-owned enterprises. There's reason to believe that shouldn't have happened. That, like you mentioned, import substitution, industrialization, it was this theory of economic growth that was really prevalent in the 50s and 60s that said, through law, we should keep out foreign capital so that internally we can build up our productive capacity. This was big in the 50s and 60s, but it didn't go away. There are still a lot of protectionist legislation and constitutional law in countries all over the world. And I was trying to figure out how come that didn't prevent Chinese state-owned enterprises from coming in. For my research, I looked at this specifically in the Philippines, where there's a constitutional provision that says the government should favor Filipino enterprises. And that constitutional provision is pretty new. It's from 1987. And yet, over the last 10 years, we've seen Chinese enterprises flood in. And so my historical question was, how come this happened? Why did this constitutional provision not keep out Chinese enterprises? And the answer, we've talked about this, was really the World Trade Organization. In the 1990s, the World Trade Organization was coming into being. There was this idea that a neoliberal form of governance was sort of inevitable, inescapable, and people in the Philippines altered their domestic legal systems to allow for the easier entrance of foreign capital. And the idea is once you change your legal system in that way, it allows for the external capital that maybe you expected, like big enterprises from the United States, big enterprises from Europe, but it also allows for Chinese state-owned enterprises to come in. And so one of the reasons Chinese state-owned enterprises have been able to get so big is because people around the world have sort of tinkered with their own legal systems to allow for foreign capital to come in. I'm not an expert on the US situation, but based on my reading of the news, this chimes with a lot of what I think has happened in the United States over the last 2 or 3 decades.
That's interesting because I went to a screening hosted by Senator Brown, when he was Senator Brown, of American Factory.
Right.
And that your conversation, your references make me think of that. Bigger picture, you've talked about the neoliberal frame. Yesterday when I was doing a panel with my colleague Charles and my friend Sander, we were talking at this point, we were talking about the intersectionality of trade and finance and debt and dollar dominance. Just a real recognition that we're in the midst of a very fundamental shift.
Right.
So we had Keynesianism to neoliberalism. Now we're going to have something else. But I think this is one way to start figuring out what that something else might look like.
Absolutely.
Anything else you guys want to add before we wrap up?
I have nothing else to get off my chest.
I thought that was a great conversation. I learned a lot from both of you throughout, so thank you.
Terrific. Thank you both for joining today. I'm hoping that this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation so that we can connect all of these dots so that we get better outcomes for China, because certainly we feel like this model is very successful for China. They've got some real challenges with their own economy, so they're going to be looking for some off-ramps. We have our challenges, but we also can't be forgetting about those emerging economies who I think in many cases in my conversations feel like we never really emerged from a colonial dynamic. And I think that's something we're really going to want to think about for the next iteration of whatever the paradigm ends up being. So thank you both for joining me. Let me flag that at 4:15, we will be talking about the next generation of tokenization and stablecoin policies. So people who are interested in that, stay tuned. That will be at 4:15. Thank you so much.